Okay, we're going to start our lecture on faith and reason here. Notice I didn't put faith versus reason because it doesn't have to be the case, or isn't obviously the case, that the two are inconsistent. We're going to look at the possibility that being faithful and being reasonable are things that can share the same space, that can overlap conceptually. So here's our first question. Is it rational to have faith? There'll be some that will have the perspective that faith goes beyond the rational. There's another perspective that faith and reason, faith and being faithful and having and being rational can you can be both at the same time. So let's clear up some definitions when it comes to faith. There seems to be some tie to evidence. So if there's sufficient evidence for having some belief, faith doesn't seem to come into the picture. Faith doesn't seem to be necessary. So our first definition will be this. Someone has faith in something only if she believes that thing, we'll call it X, despite some gap in the evidence. Now this gap can take different forms. So despite no evidence, counter evidence, and some but insufficient evidence. So let's do examples of each of these three so we can tell the difference. What would be an example of having faith in something where there's no evidence? Well, if you're familiar with the flying spaghetti monster, who is the joke god of Pastafarians, there's this group of atheists who think that believing in God is silly, so they say, well, believing in God and angels is just like believing in a flying spaghetti monster. Both are equally absurd. So they call, instead of Rastafarians, they call themselves Pastafarians. Pasta for spaghetti. Now, is there any evidence for the flying spaghetti monster? No, there's zero evidence for the flying spaghetti monster. No one's ever seen this monster. There's never been any physical evidence of a trace being left by such a creature. So there's just no evidence for the flying spaghetti monster. So if you believed in the flying spaghetti monster, you could say that's having faith in the flying spaghetti monster despite having no evidence. What about counter evidence? So this is where you believe in something, and it's not just that there's no evidence, there's actually evidence against your belief. So when it comes to the flying spaghetti monster, there really isn't evidence against the flying spaghetti monster. Now you might say, but isn't the absence of evidence count as evidence? Well, the absence of evidence isn't automatically evidence the other direction. So we should be clear about that. So there's not, there's not, expert testimony saying that there's no flying spaghetti monster. It's not like somebody searched the universe, every corner of the universe, and then came back and said, nope, couldn't find him. That would be counter evidence, but we don't have that. So if you believe that the world is flat, then you could argue then you're having faith in something despite that there's counter evidence. So there is evidence against the idea that the earth is flat. So there's evidence that runs counter to that idea. So if you believe it anyway, not only is there, it goes beyond no evidence, there's counter evidence. So you could argue this is the worst examples of faith, where you believe something and reason is pointing you in the opposite direction. So I think most cases of faith, when it comes to religion at least, is this C category. It's not when there's no evidence. Maybe there's some cases of that where there's no evidence either way. It's rarely when there's counter evidence. It's usually there's some evidence, but it's just not enough. There's still a gap. There's still room for that so-called leap of faith. So there's some, but it's inadequate. It's not 100%. It's what we'll call insufficient. So, for example, believing in aliens, so this is Alf, a Muppet version of an alien from a 1980s sitcom, Alf, ALF, Alien Life Form. Really funny show, if you've ever seen it. There's there's some evidence that there's life out there, just in the fact that the universe is so big and there's so many stars and so many galaxies, and now we know there's so many planets. Scientists are discovering new planets every day, and we're also discovering new planets that are very Earth-like, and we're discovering water, the potential for water outside of Earth. As these discoveries are made, they show up in the news all the time. So that's nudging in this certain direction, that there could be the potential for this life out there, intelligent life or life of any form. But it's not conclusive. So there's some evidence, but not enough, so it's insufficient. Okay, so that's what faith is. And what's the relationship to reason? Where there's this English philosopher named William Clifford, and he wrote this paper called The Ethics of Belief in 1874, and he argues for a view called evidentialism. Evidentialism is the view that it's always wrong to believe anything when there's insufficient evidence. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone, it's a very strong statement, to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So in the movie Titanic, you've got Kate Winslet and you've got Leo DiCaprio, and they believed with all their heart that their love would go on and they would survive, but they did not. It took me a long time to find an image of the skeleton that had the right angle and the right direction of before and after. So that's it. Clifford's view is very plain, and he thinks it makes a lot of sense that when you've got enough evidence, that's when you should believe, and anything short of that, you should just not believe. It's not that you have to have the anti-belief. You can just be agnostic. You can just withhold belief. So when it comes to aliens, you don't have to believe in aliens, yes or no. You could just say there's just not enough evidence to say either way, so I'm not going to believe. I'm not going to have that sort of faith. There's another William James, who is an American philosopher, and he argued that there are at least some cases where it's legitimate to have faith. Not all cases of faith are justified, but there are some cases. And he wrote in this book, The Will to Believe, about when those cases are. The thesis I defend is, briefly stated, our passional nature, so he's talking about faith there, because he thinks it's connected more to emotions than reason, must and lawfully may decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. So when reason doesn't point you in any direction, right? So this would be cases where there's insufficient evidence. So reason isn't saying yes or no. Like, what does reason say about aliens out there in the universe? It's not saying yes or no, is it? So it has to be a case like that. So a case where there's some but insufficient evidence, or maybe no evidence, but certainly not counter evidence. That's one of the necessary components for when it's okay to have faith. So he calls this a genuine option. When we're faced with a genuine option, then it's okay to have faith or decide with our passional nature. So faith is a matter of the passions or emotions, not of reason. So when exactly is this genuine option? Well, there are three parts of it. Let us call decisions between two hypotheses or two ideas an option. Options may be of several kinds. They may be living or dead, forced or avoidable, and momentous or trivial. For our purposes, we'll call it a genuine option when it's forced, living, and momentous. So let's talk about these three dichotomies. So a living option is just one that is sensible, really. Is it an option for us to travel back in time? Is it an option for someone to be a married bachelor? Is it an option for us to kill Hitler? No, none of these are living options because they're impossible. So there can't be so much counter evidence that it drives it impossible. If something is forced, that means that you gotta take a stance. You can't just sit on the fence. You're not allowed to be agnostic. So my example of when you have to make a decision, you have to make a decision either way. That's what it means to be forced. If it's avoidable, then you can just say, I'm not going to make a decision either way. So when it comes to deciding on whether there's aliens on other planets, that's an avoidable option because you don't have, no one's, no, there's no one has to make that decision. In the 1960s and 70s, when men and women were being shipped off to Vietnam for the Vietnam War, whether or not you were going to participate in that war as a young person, that was a forced decision. You had to say yes or no. There was no just kind of, well, I'll make the decision later. No. You maybe got your number was called, and you were drafted, and the military's saying you have to go. And so what was your only other option? You could, people went to Mexico and Canada, or some people filled out the paperwork to become conscientious observers, where they just, war is just not a part of their essential beliefs. So that's an example of a forced option. Let's see, another example of a forced option would be, if any decision at gunpoint would be a forced option. If you were if you were doing some early shopping, let's say a birthday was coming up, but it was months away, and you're shopping online, and you're like, okay, I've narrowed it down to A or B. Do I need to make a decision? No, it's not forced, because if the birthday were in a few minutes, then it's forced. It's come to a head. But if it's months away, it's not forced. So that's the difference. Momentous versus trivial. Deciding, do I want chocolate or vanilla ice cream? That's trivial. Momentous is, do I go to war or not? Do I take this job or not? Do I believe in God or not? That's momentous. So big decisions are momentous. Forced decisions are ones that you can't avoid. And then living or dead just means that, is it something that is something that you can really actually decide? You can decide for chocolate ice cream over vanilla. You can decide to go to war or not. You can decide to get married or not. You can decide to believe in God or not. But you can't decide to kill Hitler. You can't decide you're going to be a married bachelor. You can't decide that 2 + 2 = 5. All those things are logically impossible. So those aren't real options. So think about the difference between deciding to go to Vietnam or not in the 1970s when you've been drafted, deciding whether or not to get married, and deciding whether or not to get a tattoo. So which of those would be a genuine option? Which of those would be a living, forced, momentous decision? Well, let's start with the Vietnam War. It's certainly living. Actually, all three of these are living, so that's kind of the easy one. But is it forced and momentous? Well, it is forced and it is momentous. So I think James would say it would be okay to go with your heart on that one. That decision could be made. Your decision doesn't have to be rational in that case. Now, what about getting a tattoo? Certainly that's a momentous decision because it's something you're going to have for the rest of your life. But notice it's not forced, because you don't have to make a decision about getting a tattoo right now. So you can't say, I have faith that I'm going to, in my decision to make a tattoo. That wouldn't make sense because it's not forced. What about marriage? Marriage certainly is momentous, but it's not forced. I mean, I guess it could be forced, but for many of us, you don't have to get married tomorrow. You could get married, if you're not already married, you could get married in a year or in 10 years or whatever. So when it comes to believing in God, is that living? Yeah, certainly it's option. It's not impossible. It's an option out there. Is it momentous? Well, yeah, believing in God's going to be a big, whether or not you believe in God's going to be a big decision. It's certainly momentous. And is it force? Well, James is going to argue that it is. William James is going to argue that it is force because you have to decide now whether or not you're going to believe, because your judgment day is based on the actions of your life, and you can't, if you put off that decision for too long, it could be too late. So it's something that you have to decide now. It's a lifestyle for your whole life. It's not something you can say like, oh, I'll decide about God later. I'll decide about God later. I'll decide about God later. No, you got to make that choice now. And even if you're agnostic, that's on the no side of the fence. So you've made a decision about it. So that's what a genuine option is. So this is just kind of putting in the bullet points what's in that passage there. All right, so we've got the two views. William James would say, or let's start with William Clifford. William Clifford, the British philosopher, he argued, never okay to have faith. You should only believe in something when there's sufficient evidence. William James is going to say, nope, there are some cases where there's insufficient evidence where it's okay to have faith. What are those cases? When it's a genuine option. What does that mean to have a genuine option? It's a decision that's live, forced, and momentous. What does that mean? It's got to be something it's got to be available. That's what it means to be live. You need to, basically it's you got to decide now for whatever reason. That means it's forced, and it's got to be a big decision. If those criteria are met, then he thinks it's acceptable to have faith. William Clifford would say, even if it's a genuine option, even if it's a live, forced, momentous decision, still not allowed to have faith because there's insufficient evidence. So those are the two views on faith. Faith schmaith. So there was there are these philosophers, namely St. Thomas Aquinas and Anselm. They thought that if you have faith in God, that's great. But even if you don't, you still should believe because there is evidence. There is sufficient evidence for God. And I think we looked at least one of those potential proofs for the existence of God. But what we're going to talk about now is the work of a French mathematician named Blaise Pascal, who wrote in the 1600s, in the 17th century. He claimed that there is sufficient evidence to believe in God. He claims that it was rational. So he would say, even if you side with William Clifford and believe in evidentialism, evidentialism would include belief for God because there is sufficient evidence for that belief. So let's go. So here's what Pascal might have looked like. Here's a painting or a drawing of him. Let's talk about what his argument was, that there is evidence for God. So here's a contemporary living philosopher named Ian Hacking. He actually ran a seminar that I participated in, a couple of them at UC Santa Cruz when I was getting my doctorate. God is or he is not. This is the way Pascal abbreviates the partition of the Parisian. Which way should we incline? Reason cannot answer. That is, there is no valid proof or disproof for God's existence. So this is actually not the view of Pascal. He thinks that there is a proof for God's existence. Let us weigh the gain and the loss involved in wagering that God exists. Let us estimate these two probabilities. If you win, you win it all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he does exist. So that captures what Pascal is talking about. Now, I'm sure that's probably meaningless to you now. So let me explain exactly what's going on. Well, let's continue with Hacking in the second paragraph here. We assume that if God is not, then either course of action is roughly equal utility. But this is untrue. The libertine is giving up something if he chooses to adopt a pious form of life. The libertine is someone who is an atheist who lives his life without having to devote their life to God. It's kind of the easy path. You don't have to go to church and give to charity and tell the truth and worry about these commands. So if that person gives their life up to be devout and be pious, they have to give up all those pleasures. They're going to drinking and smoking and gambling and lying sometimes and not going to church or temple or the mosque. He likes sin. If God is not, the worldly life, that's the life of having fun and kind of being a hedonist, is preferable to the cloistered one. So the cloistered one is one that is the pious life, where you have to be more devout, kind of like the life of a monk or a nun. The decision problem is constituted by the two possible states of the world and the two possible courses of action. If God is not, both courses of action are pretty much on par. You will live out your life, you'll have no bad effects either way from the supernatural intervention. But if God exists, then wagering that there is no God brings damnation. Wagering that God exists can bring salvation. Salvation is better than damnation, hence the wager. God is, dominates the wager. He is not. Dominates the wager, he is not. The decision problem is solved. But there is an infinite of infinitely happy life to win. One chance of winning against a finite number of chances of losing. And what you stake is finite. That removes all doubt as to choice. Wherever the infinite is, and there is not an infinite of chances of loss against a chance of winning, there are no two ways about it. All must be given. So I just read a lot. It probably went over most of your heads, and that's where you should be, because I went so fast. So let's go through this slowly and clearly. What's going on with Pascal's wager? Remember, his big idea is that reason points you to believe in God. So we were talking earlier about faith and reason. And we started with the idea that there's insufficient evidence for God. Now, a lot of people would take issue with that. And we might have talked about some of them. But for a lot of people, yeah, it's a leap of faith. There's a gap. There might be some evidence for God. You know, we love each other, our existence, the beauty in life. These are some pieces of evidence for God's existence. Some might say this is sufficient, but set those people aside. There's some evidence, but it's insufficient. So William Clifford would argue, well, insufficient evidence, don't believe. William James would say, well, hold on. Is it a forced, momentous, live decision? Then then faith can have a role. But what Pascal is going to argue, the radical idea, is that there is sufficient evidence to believe in God. And it's based on math. That's what's so cool. It's based on a principle called expected utility. So here's Pascal's equation that's based on expected utility. That's going to be his key, or the key, to the claim that it's rational to believe in God. Expected utility involves probability. The probability that you win the bet, we'll say, and you multiply it by what you win, and then you calculate the probability you'll lose the bet, and you multiply that by what you lose. Pascal argued that if the expected utility of an action or belief is positive, then it's rational to take the bet or to hold the belief. So what is the bet? We're betting on God. We're betting on whether or not God exists. Now, what do you win if God exists and you believe in God? Well, on the traditional Christian view, you get salvation. You get an eternal life with God in heaven. Now, we have to put a value on that. Well, that would seem to be infinite value. So that's what your winnings would be. Now, what's the probability of winning that? Well, it's the probability of God existing. God has to exist for you to win this bet. Now, even if we make the odds of God existing extremely low, as long as they're positive, and non-zero, somewhat, even if it's 1 out of a billion or 1 out of a trillion, when you multiply that very, very low fraction times infinity, you're going to get infinity. So the left hand of our subtraction, the probability of winning times winnings, will be infinity. So what is the probability of losing? Well, it's going to be the number 1, and then we'll subtract that fraction. So if the odds are 1 out of a million that God exists, then the probability of losing the bet would be the odds that God doesn't exist, which would be 999,999 over a million, which is very, very close to 1. And then you multiply it by what you lose. Well, people think, oh, if you lose, you go to hell. But that's not right. We're betting on whether or not God exists. And to win the bet, God has to exist. So if you bet on God and God doesn't exist, you're not going to go to hell because there's no hell if God doesn't exist, presumably. So what you lose is all that effort you put into living a good Christian life. Right? So it's harder to live that good Christian life. And you have to put that extra level of difficulty into some kind of dollar amount or value amount. So you might have to give to the church plate on the weekends. You might have to be more honest. You might have to sacrifice, lots of fun, right? You might not be able to party as much. You won't be able to drink as much or gamble or, romantic sexual interactions that you won't be able to have if you're living this good Christian life, at least on kind of more traditional views or rules. So whatever that, to come up with this amount, put it this way: how much would you have to pay an atheist to live the life of a Christian? It's not going to be an infinite amount of money, but they might say, I wouldn't want to live that life. Well, would you do it for $50? No. Would you do it for $10,000? No. Would you do it for $100,000? Ooh, maybe. Would you do it for $1 million or 2 million or 10 million? Now it's gonna be like, oh yeah, the atheist might be like, I don't want to live that Christian life, but if you give me $1 million, then I'll live it. So that's really what that's the number we're looking at. So you take that 999,999 over 1 million, and then why don't we just multiply it by 1 million to make the math easy? So that the millions cancel out, and you get 6 nines, right? 999, 999. So that's what's on the right side of our subtraction here. On the left, again, is infinite, right? Is an infinite amount because of the infinite amount of winnings. So what's infinity minus, 999,999? Well, infinity minus anything finite is going to be infinity. So if the after you do the subtraction, if the answer you get is a positive number, then you should take the bet. So then your expected utility is positive, and you should take the bet. Well, not only was our expected utility positive, but it was infinite. So according to Pascal, if the expected utility is positive, then it's rational to do or hold. So ours was totally positive, beyond positive, so therefore it's rational to bet on God, to believe in God, or to live the life of a Christian. Now, are there objections to this Pascal move? There certainly are. It seems as long as the probability of God existing is greater than 0, and as long as the utility for believing is infinite, it doesn't matter how unlikely God's existence is, it's still rational to believe. As Hacking puts it, although we have no idea of the chance that God exists, it's not 0. Otherwise, there'd be no problem. There's a finite positive chance that God exists. No matter what this finite chance is, no matter how small, the expectations of the pi strategy with the infinite reward, right? Infinite reward exceeds that of a worldly one. Hence, the pi strategy must be followed. This is the argument from dominating expectation. This is what Pascal was arguing. And if we did we bet on God. If we ran it for believing in God, if we checked the expected utility of not believing, it would turn out that it's negative. So not only is it rational to believe in God? It's something that we should do. It's actually irrational to not believe. So what Pascal has defended, he's defended Christians, not only Christians their beliefs aren't out there. Their beliefs are totally rational. And atheists, non-Christians, they're the ones who are rational. That's the conclusion of Pascal. It's amazing. Is a corollary that Pascal's argument is good for any decision problem with the same formal structure. An imam could reason just as well this way. So an imam is a leader of a Muslim community. So this is an objection. It's the many gods objection. So that's what Hacking argued. We could use Pascal's wager to prove the existence of anything that offered eternal bliss as a reward for adherence. So there's got to be something fishy going on, Hacking's arguing, because you could use Pascal's wager to defend the rationality of believing not only in the Christian God, but in the God of Islam. You could say, well, it's the same God, so that's fine. Or it could be the God of some small religion you've never heard of. The only condition that needs to be met is that God promises eternal bliss as a reward for believing. That's all you need. So right now I could say, hey, don't believe in God, believe in Zod. That's the name for. I'm Ryan. I start a new religion, and don't believe the Christian God or the Muslim God or Jewish God or Zoroastrian God. Forget all that stuff. You should believe in Zod, a being I called Zod. And if you believe in Zod, you'll go to paradise. That's if you believe in God, it won't work out. But you believe in Zod, you'll get eternal bliss. Well, what are the odds that Zod exists? You can't say 0, because for all we know, there is this Zod that exists. So you can't say 0, and the rewards are infinite. So when you do the math, you'll get infinity for the left side of the subtraction. And then, what do you have to sacrifice to believe in Zod? Even if it's a lot, it doesn't matter, because when you take infinity and you subtract some finite amount, you're going to get infinity. So there's something weird going on here. And then the second objection is the idea of infinite utility even coherent? Right? What does it mean for what is this idea of infinite utility of this after? Can we really measure what utility or the dollar value on heaven's going to be? It doesn't seem like we can, or that would be difficult, and that's one of the things that's required for us to take this wager. What is heaven like? Here's a cartoon that says, "I miss stress." Is it just kind of hanging out in the clouds with angels' wings? I mean, what do you do? Is there really no conflict? What is this perfect place, and how could anything be perfect? So this idea that heaven or the afterlife is worth an infinite amount starts to become incoherent. And if it does, then Pascal's wager is in trouble. So to recap, we talked about definitions of faith, believing in something when there's no evidence, like believing in the flying spaghetti monster, believing in something when there's counter evidence, believing the world is flat, believing in something when there's some but insufficient evidence, like believing in alien life on another world. Then we talked about whether or not it's rational to have faith. William Clifford argues no. If there's insufficient evidence, then you should not believe. William James said if in a special circumstance where it's a big decision and you have to make it, and it's at least a possibility, then you can decide with your passional nature, you can have faith. And then we looked at Pascal's wager, which was a French mathematician who argued, actually, it's rational to believe in God. You don't need to go in the faith direction. You can just stick with reason. And I have a mathematical method to show that. As long as God offers eternal bliss and the odds of God existing are greater than 0, then the expected utility of believing in God is going to be positive, and that means that you should believe. But the objection to that is there's something funky with that structure because you could use it to say we should believe in all sorts of beings. The God of fill in the blank religion, the God even of a made up religion like Zod. And then again, the equation only works if we if you put in that infinity for the winnings. And it's not exactly clear that we can do that because it's not clear what infinite utility means exactly. Is that what is a perfect life? And it's, we try to imagine a perfect life. You think of angels in heaven, and it seems to be pretty boring. Okay, so that sums up our lecture on faith and reason.